Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Irish Humanities Alliance doctoral training event. Today, we are hosting two sessions. This first session will examine academic publishing, and the second, commencing at 12:15, will explore social media in academia. As you can see from the program, we have put together two expert panels to explore each of these themes. Before I hand over to our chair for this first panel, Professor Chris Williams, I would like to say a few words about the Irish Humanities Alliance. The Alliance was established in 2013 as an all-island body encompassing humanities research in 11 higher education and research institutions, north and south. It includes 10 universities and the Royal Irish Academy, which houses and supports the work of the IHA. And of course, for 2021-2022, we have for the first time an IHA chair in each jurisdiction on the island. We bring a coordinated humanities perspective to research policy issues, and we work to promote the vital importance of the humanities in the context of a higher education landscape increasingly shaped by economic considerations. We were also founder members of the European Alliance for Social Sciences and Humanities, IHA, and remain active members of this body. We work closely with key stakeholders, including the Irish Research Council, NCPs, and national delegates. You can follow us on Twitter at Irish Humanities, and we also have a YouTube channel. You can visit irishhumanities.com for more information about the work of the IHA, our strategy statement, By Imagination We Live, our humanities blog, our annual reports, and various policy papers and position papers. I would now like to hand over to Professor Chris Williams of UCC, who is the chair of the Irish Humanities Alliance for 2021-2022. He will introduce our first panel.
Thank you very much indeed, Mel, and a very warm welcome to everybody who's joining this event. This is the second time, I think, that we've done a doctoral training event. We did one probably about 15 months or so ago now, which was really successful, looking at future directions in the humanities and accessing archives, libraries, and digital repositories. And so for today, we're focusing on academic publishing, and we're focusing on social media. And after the break, my colleague and the vice chair of the IHA, Dr. Maxime Fomin, will be chairing that session. But it's my great pleasure to introduce the first panel today on academic publishing. And I suppose some of the thinking that's gone into this panel comes from all of our own experiences on the IHA of negotiating and navigating the issues around publishing, particularly for early career scholars. There isn't a single golden path to the sunlit uplands of academic success. There are many different publishers. There are many possibilities in terms of how to get one's work out there. And I suppose there's a great deal of need for advice and guidance, and that can come, of course, from doctoral supervisors. It can come from colleagues, friends, mentors. But we thought, why not go to some of the people who have real expertise in this field to explain from their perspective some of the issues, some of the pitfalls to watch out for, some of the opportunities to seize when one is seeking to get one's work published in the most appropriate and high-ranking places. So with that in mind, we've assembled an expert panel, and it's my great pleasure to introduce them very briefly to you before we hand over for the seminar proper. First up today will be Professor Rebecca Braun, who is Executive Dean of the College of Arts, Social Sciences and Celtic Studies and Professor of German at the National University of Ireland, Galway. And Rebecca is a stellar researcher and experienced publisher in her own right as an academic. She's has experience as well of editing a journal, and she, of course, has built a career not only in Ireland but also in the United Kingdom, and has extensive experience of working with colleagues around the world. And Rebecca will be our first speaker. Our second, I'm sorry, Rebecca will be our last speaker. So I do apologize. Rebecca will be our last speaker. So I'm going to go in reverse order. There we go. So our third speaker will be Sarah Lewis, and it's a great pleasure to have Sarah on this panel today. Sarah is Head of Commissioning at the University of Wales Press, based in Cardiff in Wales, and has worked with academics across a very wide range of disciplines, publishing, of course, academic monographs, but also University of Wales Press has responsibility for publishing journals as well. And it'd be fascinating to get Sarah's insight into the world of publishing. And then our second speaker is Dr. Clodagh Tait, and Clodagh is at Mary Immaculate College in Limerick. She's a historian, so that's a big plus in her favour, I think. And in that capacity, she's one of the editors. She's joint editor of the journal Irish Historical Studies. So it'll be great to get insight from somebody who carries the responsibility really for maintaining and publishing an academic journal, as to what journal editors are looking for and the kinds of hurdles and issues that crop up for people submitting to journals. And then our first speaker is Brendan George, and Brendan is the person responsible for publishing in philosophy at Palgrave, Macmillan. And Brendan has a long career in publishing. He's worked with other publishers, including Oxford University Press and Ashgate, and I'm sure people will be well aware that Palgrave publish a range of different kinds of academic books these days. Particularly Palgrave pivots, I suppose, have caught the imagination of some scholars in recent years. So again, it'll be great to have Brendan's insight into the publishing world. So before I do any further damage to the integrity of this event, it's a great privilege to be chair of the IHA and to be chairing this first session. And I'm now going to hand over to Brendan George. Thank you very much.
Oh, hi there, everybody. Yes, my name's Brendan George, and I'm Palgrave Macmillan's philosophy publisher. As was said, I've been at Palgrave for about 10 years, and I've worked in scholarly publishing for about, I can't believe I'm about to say this, for 34 years. And my email address is brendan.george@palgrave.com. And if you're a philosopher and at the end of this event you do decide to go ahead with a book proposal, then that's the email for you. Palgrave Macmillan publishes very widely in the humanities. So we also publish in history, as I say, in philosophy, in literature, in theatre and performance, in film, culture and media, and in religion. And we publish about 2,000 new books every year, and many of those books are by early career scholars. And we pride ourselves on the interest we take in early career scholarly publishing and the support that we provide for early career scholars. The key contacts in those areas are all available on palgrave.com, but I will give you their names so you know who you should be looking for. In history, the key contact is Emily Russell. In philosophy, it's me, Brendan George, as mentioned. In literature and in theatre and performance, it's Molly Beck. In film, culture and media, it's Lena Abugieb, and that's spelled Aboujieb. And in religion, based in New York, it's Phil Getz. So as I say, all of those, all of the contact information for those people is available on palgrave.com. Palgrave publishes very widely, a wide variety of formats, including research monographs, contributed volumes, Palgrave pivots, handbooks, textbooks, and major reference works. For early career scholars, probably the first three categories are of the most interest. So that's research monographs, contributed volumes, and Palgrave pivots. Research monographs, of course, because a transformed dissertation will usually be published as a research monograph. But early career scholars do also edit contributed volumes, although it has to be said that usually, probably more than 95% of the time when they do that, they usually do it in conjunction with a more senior scholar. Palgrave pivots are our shorter monograph format, so that is for books between 30 and 50,000 words. And if I remember, when we get to the next section of this presentation, where I will talk about what you need to bear in mind in transforming the dissertation into a book, I will mention why a Palgrave pivot might be the format for you. By the way, notice that I've talked about transforming, not converting. Some people talk about converting the dissertation into a publishable book, but it's a much bigger job than that. So I personally prefer to use the word transformation, because that is the kind of size of the task that you'll be taking on. So by some coincidence, I am now going to talk about what is required to transform the dissertation into a publishable book. And here are some key tips and hints from me. So the main thing is that you really need to refocus on the work, on your key message, on your main theme, on your key scholarly contribution. Now, this is different to a dissertation. A dissertation, one of the things you're trying to demonstrate when you do a dissertation is that you have read very widely in the subject, and therefore tangential material and digressional material is valid. This is not so appropriate in a publishable book, where we want you really focused on the main theme, which we will then draw out in the title of the book. Also, bear in mind that you are now writing for a very different market. For your dissertation, your market is primarily the examiners, the 2 or 3 people that will examine your dissertation, and they are all hopefully genuine experts in your field. But we wish to sell your book to a very wide range of scholars. So some of these scholars will not be absolute experts. They will be people with a passing interest in your work, or with some interest in your work. And we wish the book to appeal to them. But do note that I am talking about scholars still. So this is not a question of dumbing down. This is still a scholarly work, but it is a scholarly work which we wish to make appeal to a wider range of scholars. So it is very important to make it more appealing. And the way to do that is to rethink your title and to rethink the chapter titles. If your title and the chapter titles are very academic, are very, very written for experts, then rethink them, rewrite them, and make them much punchier. And that will be a key part of the transformational process. Also, globalize the examples. Now, your new examples will not probably be as rigorous as your original dissertation examples, but all the same, if you can introduce some additional, perhaps slightly less well-researched examples that will add to the texture and to the appeal of the book into other markets, into other territories, for instance, then that would be excellent. How long does it take for this transformation? It will take at least 9 months, and some authors take longer than that, so 18 months perhaps. Now, not all dissertations are appropriate for transformation, and I hope that from what I've already said, you might have got the idea of what dissertations might not be so appropriate. And those are those dissertations which are very narrowly focused. Now, that is not a comment at all upon the quality of the research. It is not a comment at all on the quality of you as an author, but it is just a comment on the breadth of appeal of the subject that your dissertation is on. So if your dissertation is on a very narrow focused area, then it might not be as appropriate for publishing as a commercial scholarly book. And then the route that you would most likely take is into the journals. If then you do decide to pitch a proposal to a publisher, what do you need to do? These are the elements. A title, and as I say, reworked for the broader market. A brief description of, say, 1,000 words. A table of contents, again with your chapter titles reworked. A target markets in terms of discipline and subdisciplines. Comparable titles so that we can see that there are books that have this broader appeal that have been published previously. Delivery date and a short bio. On the basis of those elements, we can make, if it was a philosophy book, I can make an initial consideration. If after the initial consideration we wish to proceed to peer review stage, we will then ask you to submit sample material, which would usually be a sample chapter. And remember, the chapter should be for the proposed book, not for the dissertation. So that chapter will need to show that you have started to make the transformation. I'm sure you're interested in the peer review process. 2 stages for peer review: at the proposal stage and at the final manuscript stage. And as I say, there is a possibility that the peer reviewer will say this would be more appropriate for the journals, the journal route. And as I say, that is not something you should take personally. That it just says that this is the better channel would be through the journals. And also note that for Palgrave, at least, you can't do both. You do need to make a decision whether you want to go book or journals. And the reason for that is I think it is a scholarly principle that research findings should be published once. So there's no recycling is what we refer to it as. And that is a principle we uphold at Palgrave. So yes, if you come to us and you've already published a lot of the book in the journals, then we would not be able to go forward to publish it as a book. Distribution. Very briefly on this, because I'm running out of time, but on distribution, I'm sure you're aware of the digital revolution. The digital revolution has also impacted scholarly books, and that's because it's transformed libraries. In the old days, you'd have to wait for someone to bring the print book back. That is no longer the case. At a touch of the button now, we will get your book into literally hundreds of libraries worldwide, and then via those libraries, every academic, every scholar at that university, without having to wait for somebody else to bring the book back, can immediately download your book to any device. So this is at a touch of a button. We will make your book available worldwide to hundreds of thousands of scholars and students. And then if you wish to get more information on Palgrave, there's an early career researcher hub on palgrave.com. So we've got a hub, a page directly relevant for you, and it has a lot of the information that I have given today. And I hope that is helpful, and that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Brendan. That's fantastic. A great start, and definitely to time. So thanks a lot. And I'm now going to hand over to Clodagh.
So I'm here to talk to you about publishing in journals, and there's a nice kind of segue there between Brendan and myself. Can I also, having previously published with Palgrave a very long time ago, recommend them as a publisher. So I'm currently an editor of Irish Historical Studies, and I'm pleased to be talking to you not only to kind of advertise the journal a little bit, but also because I've been doing this job for about 8 months.
Okay, looks like we may have lost Clodagh temporarily. So perhaps in the circumstances we could go to Sarah, and then hopefully we'll get Clodagh back in a minute. Is that okay, Sarah?
That's absolutely fine. I'll start now. Thank you. Very well, I've got 10 minutes, so I'll crack on. I'll try and give everybody some background about the press and also some practical tips as well. I'm Sarah Lewis. I'm the head of commissioning at University of Wales Press, based down in very stormy Cardiff today. I've been there for 18 years, and I'm head of the commissioning department and commission across a broad range of humanities subjects. We're in our centenary year this year. We were created in 1922 when we were very much a marginalised voice. So UWP was created as an outlet for publishing in the Welsh language and also on Welsh subjects. We've diversified a lot, particularly in the last few decades. We've got a very broad list of humanities publishing. So we've got literary criticism. I think we're particularly well known for our Gothic list, modern languages and cultures, particularly French and Francophone and Hispanic, medieval studies, political philosophy, and of course, Celtic studies. We've got quite a few authors from Irish universities, which is absolutely wonderful, and hopefully we'll get some more as a result of today's event. My email address is s.lewis@press.wales.ac.uk, but you can find all our details on our website. We've got international distribution, and we use the University of Chicago Press in the key North American market as our partner to market and distribute our books. And we also work with a broad range of libraries, supplies and e-book aggregators to make sure that all our books get into the right places. We're a funded university press and we're not for profit. Therefore, the scholarship is absolutely an absolutely fundamental part of what we do. Although we're not for profit, we do have to work within certain financial parameters. So while not for profit is our foundation, we really do have to work within our parameters and not lose money on our publications either. For our Welsh Studies list, we do have funding from the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales. So anybody writing in that area, given the small, modest market, if your book's contracted, it should be able to get some funding. We publish authors at all stages of their career, from early career researchers right through to established scholars and professors emerita and emeritus, and also independent scholars too. I think ECRs, we hold a very special place for them at UWP, particularly in these times of precarious employment practices and uncertainty. And we know very much how key that first monograph is to you in establishing your career, or even when you're making a job application for an academic post. And we know that your research is often the result of many years of hard work and research, and it can be venturing into unknown territory when you approach a publisher. So we very much aim to make it a positive experience and advise you and guide you in every step of the way. So the dialogue with the author carries on right from the beginning until the commissioning department will hand over the manuscript to the editorial and production departments. I would always advise, before you contract a publisher, think very hard about, as Brendan was saying, about transforming your thesis, and also making sure that you approach the right publisher for your work. There's a book that I always recommend to people. It's called From Dissertation to Book by William Germano. It's about £11 in paperback. So that will give you a really good, solid overview about what to do. And in common with most university presses, we don't accept unrevised theses for publication. They can be a starting point in the creation of original and separate academic research to create this monograph, which has distinct characteristics from the thesis. As Brendan was saying, the point of a thesis is to obtain an academic qualification. When you're writing a proposal for a monograph, you're talking to a different audience, and you are talking to a peer reviewer who will look at your work from the point of view of being a monograph and not a thesis. So just to summarise again, really what Brendan was saying, that the monograph differs in that there will need some restructuring to be done to base it more on original research and less on literature review and methodology. The scope will need to be broadened, and often we get ideas in which absolutely no dispersion on the quality of the research. It's just too narrow to publish as a monograph. Also the writing style as well. I know a writing style can take years to develop, but I would advise people to try and be scholarly and accessible at the same time, and to avoid jargon if you can. I had a proposal in recently, discussed it with the series editors, and neither of us could really understand what it's about. It was so steeped in jargon. So if you can avoid that, I would definitely do so. And thinking about a publisher for your book, you've got to choose the right publisher. Obviously, in terms of subject matter, I occasionally get proposals which look really good, but they don't fall within our list. So I'd advise scholars to have a look at university press websites and see which ones publish in your area of research. So as much as a book might not be right for us, we wouldn't be the right publisher for you either. You need to choose a publisher with established lists and therefore established routes to market for your book, so they're known in the market and the market knows them for the work. Don't make simultaneous submissions to several publishers at a time. A lot of work goes in by commissioning departments in reading and developing your proposal with you. It's a small world. I recently sent out a proposal for peer review recently, and the peer reviewer said, I've been asked to read this already by another press. So it is a small world. So please be very upfront. If you are going to submit it, I advise not to several publishers, but if you do, let us know, and then we can make a decision about what we want to do with it. To start with, I would advise submitting a short synopsis to us, again, based on the monograph that it's going to be, not on the thesis, to include the title, an overview, abstract of the aims, contents and objectives of the work, a draft table of contents with a brief description about the contents of each chapter, who the target market and interested audience is, how it will contribute to the scholarly debate, have an awareness of other books in the field and how yours differs, and also say what is unique about your work. I'd also include information about the number of words in the proposed monograph as well. Once we've got that in, once I've got it, I'll take it to our commissioning meeting, discuss it with colleagues and also series editors of the relevant series. Once we have had that meeting, and if we want to take it further, we'll then ask for a formal proposal questionnaire, and we've got a pro forma. And again, this is an absolutely vital document. It needs to be completed in depth and detail. So I'd always advise authors to take their time on this. I'd rather wait for something that's complete and in depth than have something that is done quickly but doesn't contain enough information for a peer reviewer to evaluate it properly. So basically what we're going to ask a peer reviewer is about the content. Is it balanced? Is it coherent? Has it got gaps? Is it suitable for publication by university press? Is it innovative? And what the market might be. I'd always say, remember, this is what the peer reviewer evaluates your proposal and your work on. So always make it very, very detailed and in depth. One of the common comments I get from a peer reviewer is, I think the author intends to include this, but I'm not sure. So make it very clear and very express. Also bear in mind, again, we're talking about a monograph now and not the thesis, so the market will be different. You'll be trying to please a peer reviewer rather than your examiners. Think about the title. Titles for theses and monographs differ. With a monograph, the main title has really got to be descriptive and say what the book does, and a subtitle can be a bit more creative. But think about the metadata. Think about readers searching in your area of scholarship, and you want your book to come very high up in a return of any search. State early on in the proposal what the book's about and why. You know, we read a lot of material for new books, and sometimes I get a proposal which looks interesting. I have to read through about 5 pages until I see that sentence that I think, oh, right, this is what the book's about. Make it very clear up front. The proposal has to be convincing in a number of ways. It needs to be intellectually convincing, and it needs to be theoretically convincing as well. You need to show what the originality and rigor is. Include a table of contents, because that will enable a peer reviewer to see the structure of the book and also your thinking about how you've restructured the book. Also, if you've got a draft chapter, the introductory chapter is always a good chapter to send as well. And again, it's the rewritten chapter for a monograph and not the thesis. I like conclusions at the end of books, and that's another area that peer reviewers often ask for, even if it's brief. At the end of your work, the reader likes to know how you wrap up the argument. If you're publishing, say, in modern languages, I'd always advise thinking about any quotes in French or Spanish or any other language, translating the quote into English, because that will broaden the market for your book beyond readers who are speakers of the language that your research is based on. Another key point, keep up to date with the scholarly literature. There can often be a gap between when you finish your thesis and when you start to write the monograph. And another common comment from peer reviewers is that it hasn't been kept up to date with current developments in their field since the thesis was published. So it's a dynamic process, not one that stops when you've completed your thesis. Know your market, know who the intended audience is, and that will help us as publishers market your book. Edit the proposal, make sure it hasn't got any typos in it. You don't want to irritate a peer reviewer with sloppy presentation. And I always say that the peer reviewers are the unsung heroes of the academic world. They do this for the love of their subject and their encouragement of early career researchers. So make it a really impressive document. When the peer review comes through, at the end of the day, we need an unequivocal recommendation to publish the book to proceed further to contract. If you don't get that first time round, don't be discouraged. Often we get a recommendation that it's publishable, but it needs further revision or consideration. If you get that, sit down, think about it. We'll ask you to respond formally via the University of Wales Press, and we'll enter into a dialogue with the author. So don't be downhearted. Peer reviewers often include fantastic guidance about what needs to be done. Remember, it's your first book, so you will need the guidance that a peer reviewer can offer. Also, I should say in this day, think if your book needs to be open access. There's an increasing number of mandates about open access in the academic world. We're expecting in the UK the next research exercise to include a mandate for open access. I think I'm right in saying that the Irish Research Council supports it in principle, but understands the challenges for humanities where there's less funding around. When we have got that unequivocal recommendation published, we get formal approval from the university executive, and at that stage we need peer review and a budget for the book as well. With submission dates, don't be over-optimistic, be realistic. And same with word extents, please adhere to them. And if you find you're in difficulties on either, always communicate it to your commissioning editor. Once we've got the manuscript in, we send it out to peer review in its entirety again. And again, ultimate publication is dependent on positive peer review, and there may be some revision work needed then. Once we have the final manuscript, I will hand it over to the editorial and production departments. We've got very high editorial standards at the press, and we know that it's a very precious thing for us to publish your work. So we make sure all our processes reflect that. We'll also ask you to complete a marketing questionnaire. You're the authority on your work, and I think it's very pertinent that panel 2 today is about social media. So we always like our authors to tweet and be social media savvy. Finally, I'm going to actually be in Dublin at the end of July at the Gothic Association conference. So if there's any Gothicists around or horror, see if you can attend. We'll be there in person, and we'd absolutely love to meet you. So I think my 10 minutes are there, or I've just gone over. So I think that's it for me, but always get in touch with us, always talk to us.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. That's fantastic. And we've got Clodagh back. So Clodagh, we'll go to you again. Thank you.
So I was talking to you about Irish historical studies and about publishing in journals more generally. And I should say a few words about Irish historical studies if you're not familiar with it. And this is a journal that was founded in 1938, and it's the joint journal of the Irish Historical Society and the Ulster Society for Irish Historical Studies. The journal publishes articles embodying original research in Irish history and kind of broadly defined Irish diaspora history and so on, articles on the scope and teaching of Irish history, select documents, select and critical bibliographies, and guides to sources, and reviews of books and periodicals that have a bearing on Irish history. However, for a long time, the journal would have probably have been considered to have had a particular focus on political and administrative history, with lots of history by men, about men. Many of the, most of the editors and contributors were men, and most of the books reviewed had been written by men, which brings me to my first point. What do you consider when you're thinking about where to put your article? So you have an idea about an article, and you're looking for somewhere to put it. And in that case, I'd advise looking at what the particular journals or potential journals that you're interested in have actually been publishing recently. See how your piece might fit in, because I think sometimes the focus of journals changes over time. Certainly in Irish historical studies, the range of the kinds of articles published have changed over the last 10 years or so, and it's kind of moving towards that definition of kind of publishing an Irish history, very broadly defined. Irish historical studies still does put the political and administrative history, but it also does social and cultural history, women's and gender history, and so on. So, you know, as somebody myself who focuses on these kinds of things, I might not have considered publishing in Irish historical studies 10 or 15 years ago, but I certainly would now. If you're not sure whether your potential contribution fits in with the journal, you can contact the editors. They'd be happy to let you know whether, you know, on principle something might be suitable or not. Other things to think about, first of all, word count. Consider the word count allowed by the journal and stick with it. Usually the count for history journals is between about 8,000 and 12,000 words. Some may leave it a little bit open, and Irish Historical Studies does leave it a little bit open for longer articles, but it does depend a lot on the nature of the topic, and you need to maybe run it by the editors if you want to go above the normal length. This is very much me as the poacher turned gamekeeper. I'd say every editor I've ever worked with is laughing right at this point, because I'm always the one who comes in with very long articles and have to sweat them down. But actually, you know, sometimes you find that killing your darlings, it can be a useful exercise actually, and that process of sweating down the words can help focus your understanding of your own article, as well as making it more effective as a piece of work. articles, just like the publishers were saying, you know, that the books submitted need to be books. Likewise, articles submitted need to be articles. If they've originated from a thesis, they will probably again need to be rethought and restructured in order to be effective standalone pieces. And you might be able to get some advice on this from your supervisor or some other critical friend. The article needs to show that it's not just providing interesting information, but it needs to have some sense of how it contributes to broader debate, or how it contributes to our broader understanding of the particular subject. It needs to have, I think Brendan used the term, a key scholarly concept. It needs to have to show it knows where it is and how it is contributing. Other things that you might think about as you're at that point of submitting are things like paying attention to the rules for contributors of the particular journal, and these might change across, it'd be different across journals. The rules for Irish historical studies are kind of notoriously stringent in some ways, and you don't necessarily at this point need to be at that, you know, have them absolutely perfectly, and certainly, you know, since you might have, you know, previously submitted this in some other form, you might have used a different referencing system. But, you know, pay attention to those contributors. At some point in your journey, if you end up getting your articles accepted, you're going to have to apply them to the article. Articles are usually anonymized for review before being sent for review, and you can contribute to this by ensuring that if you're, for example, if you're referring to your own work, you kind of refer to yourself in the third person and things like that, that you keep as little identifying information in the text of the article. You know, the editors will go through it anyway and kind of further anonymize it, but that's something that can be paid attention to beforehand as well. So once your article is ready to go, depending on the journal, you might be submitting it in one of two ways. You might be emailing it directly to the editors, or you might be submitting it via kind of specialist software like Scholar One or something like that. So different journals can have different policies. At the moment in Irish Historical Studies, you're submitting directly to me, usually for an article. But we will be moving to a Scholar One system at some point during this year, hopefully. And this helps us kind of more effectively manage what has been submitted and where everything is at. Now, at this point, your article might be returned by the editor as being unsuitable for publication in the journal, or it might be sent for review by 2 or more readers. Irish Historical Studies usually has 2 readers, maybe 3. Something like Past and Present, I understand, might have up to 5 readers. And you normally at this point receive a communication acknowledging your submission and telling you how long the review process is likely to take. And it can at the moment take a good while to receive the final report. The editors have to find 2 people willing to act as readers, and colleagues are quite overburdened at the moment. So, you know, between kind of finding people who can do that job, and then can fit it in alongside, finding a point at which they can fit it in alongside their other work, can take a little bit of time. And then there's kind of further time for the editor to kind of create the final response to you. However, don't feel apologetic about contacting the editors if you haven't had a reply within the initially mentioned time scale, or if as well, you know, sometimes it might be the case that you're looking for postdoctoral funding or something like that, and it might be helpful to have a forthcoming publication on your CV for that. And in that case, you know, and 3 or 4 months have gone by, you can always just mention that to the other editor, just to prompt them. Feel free to do that. The peer review reports can be communicated in different kinds of ways. In Irish historical studies, the practice is to synthesize the reports into a kind of single digest, and this allows the editor to adjudicate when it comes to disagreements or maybe contradictions in the reader's comments, rather than sending two kind of raw sets of comments, which sometimes do contradict one another, or one reader might particularly like a particular section and the other reader might not. A kind of digest of reports in our case we find is kind of helpful in reconciling any inconsistencies. These digests are sometimes long and detailed, and this reflects often the amount of effort that the reviewers have put into, and their interest and enthusiasm for the subject that is being discussed. So don't get discouraged if you get very long comments, because actually that can be really, really helpful. And I find usually these comments are offered in a spirit of collegiality and desire to maximize the effectiveness of the piece of work. You might then receive a response that will do one of three things, probably. You might be given an offer of publication, usually subject to the completion of some of the revisions suggested by the readers. And sometimes, lots of suggestions are made, and it may not always be feasible to include them all. And as long as you kind of explain that can be fine. So that might be the first option. Second option might be that you might be told that no offer is being extended at this time, but the way might be left open for a new version of the article to be reconsidered a little further down the line. Or of course, the article might be rejected. And again, if this happens, you might well feel a little bit disappointed or discouraged, but you'd usually have received some useful feedback. And you should remember that just because this journal, whatever journal it is, has declined to publish the article, it doesn't mean it's unpublishable. It might need more work or thought or refocusing, or maybe it might be more suited to a different type of outlet. That might also be an option. If you have been offered a publication slot, you'll be given a reasonable amount of time in which to return your revised article and incorporate the feedback. Very briefly, just a couple of final things that occurred to me. There are a number of Irish journals, including IHS, that publish edited primary sources. IHS has a series of select documents, which would involve shortish or medium length documents accompanied by a commentary. And sometimes these can be kind of useful outlets for, something that's fallen off the back of a thesis, a little bit that you would have liked to have explored more in the thesis and maybe not have had an opportunity to do so. And of course, there are other journals like Archivium Hibernicum and Analecta Hibernica who also publish kind of edited documents of that kind. IHS has just published our first roundtable article. So, have a look at recent volumes of journals and think a little bit as well about how maybe publishing formats are changing and how new types of ways of getting across debates and discussions are being how these are being put forward in journals. So we might be open in some cases to receive proposals for roundtables or other types of communications. And if you're dipping your toe in publishing, you might consider contacting journals offering your services as a reviewer as well, because this can be a way of getting used to the process of publishing in journals. If there's a book you particularly like to read, and you could get in contact with the reviews editor. In our case, that's Marie Coleman in Queen's University. I'm sure she'd be happy to try and at least to source the book, or would welcome people who would like to put forward their services as a reviewer as well. And that's as a way of maybe kind of, as I said, dipping your toe in and getting to understand the process as well. So I better leave it there.
Thank you very much, Clodagh. And I think it's just worth saying in this context that, you know, in many ways, journal editors are the unsung heroes of disciplines because they do enormous amounts of work, which is of vital significance to the scholarly health of a discipline, and they often get relatively little credit or visibility for all of that effort. So I think it's just worth making that comment at this stage. So thank you very much indeed, Clodagh. Great that you were able to join us, and we'll now pass on to our final panelist this morning, and that's Rebecca Braun. Rebecca.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Chris. And thank you to all my colleagues. It's been really interesting to hear the just the insights from the publishing perspective. So I've been kind of cued to give the perspective from your regular academic who's gone through all of this, and I am also wearing the hat of a journal editor, so I can feed some of that in too. But I thought I might just start by sharing a little secret, which is why I ended up being last rather than first in this presentation. And that's because at the start, when the panel was convening, I said, I actually don't really quite know what I'm going to say. And in a very kind attempt to save my modesty, everyone said, it's okay, you can listen and then go later, and which is great. But the not knowing what to say, not quite knowing how to approach the topic, is also kind of metaphorical, I think, for where the academic finds himself in the process of trying to get published. And no matter how much information is out there, I don't know, certainly in my own experience, and I think probably reflecting on, you know, conversations I've had with colleagues over the years, there's always a sense that you don't quite know how to fit into it, or you don't quite believe the system is going to work for you. So not quite knowing where to start and how to go about it is a little bit sort of where things lie when you're coming into this from the academic perspective. So I thought what I would do in my little slot is just really give you an honest appraisal of some of the things I've encountered and some of the where I stand now on reflecting on this process, but with the huge caveat that in some ways I still don't entirely know the best way of doing any one particular thing, whether it's trying to get a book published or place an article or put together an edited volume or you know, engage with the peer review process. These things are always somewhat imponderable. So I thought I'd start with the point about transforming your thesis, and I absolutely understand the idea that it's not so much just converting the thesis into a monograph as transforming it into a book. And that is a very sound advice, points very well made. I'm going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate though, and say it's not necessarily the case that you need to do massive transformational work to get your thesis into a book. It does depend very much on the thesis. And I was particularly fortunate with my own thesis that I had always kind of imagined it as a book. And I had kind of phrased not only what's the thing that I want to prove, which is kind of where the thesis goes, the specific argument that I'm going to prove and should do all my due diligence with, but, you know, why should the wider world care? And that, to my mind, is the framing for a book. What, you know, you've done your proving, why does the wider world care about it? That's what's got to come out in the book. And I'd kind of always thought along those lines. So actually I had a fairly smooth transition from a thesis into a book, which was both fortunate and unfortunate, because it meant that the thesis was kind of that book publishing experience went very smoothly, so that when I came with the second book, I actually didn't really know what to do, as in I hadn't had to go through the whole pitching and presenting and thinking about it as a book and having a rather scrappy ragbag of ideas and trying to put it together. But I was far too advanced in my career to let on to anybody that I didn't quite know what to do. So I was in a rather uncomfortable place with it. And I'm really just saying that by way of example, that, you know, there aren't ready-made answers to these things, and you kind of have to figure out the situation you're in and what the best way is to go about it. So going back to being at the beginning of your career, it's natural that a publisher's perspective is, you know, it's got to be as good a book as it possibly can, and it's not just simply a case of lifting your thesis and putting it between two book covers and hoping people will read it. At the same time, in terms of from an academic perspective for career development, you don't want to get too bogged down in making the perfect book. if you're looking at your thesis and you think, oh, actually, and I think this is a bit of a tendency that many of us have as natural sort of perfectionists, you keep honing and honing, and you've already been honing and honing for 3 to 4 years in writing the thesis. And then if you get into a mindset that I have to hone and hone again, you can drive yourself a bit mad and at some point not really help the process of either getting the good book or getting on with the next thing that you want to do. So I suppose I would just caution against finding yourself drawn into a total repackaging of what you're doing, because it is also okay for the book just to be good enough. And that's where you have to have the confidence to say it's good enough for the purposes of getting this particular piece of research out to a wider audience. It's maybe not going to be the biggest audience in the world. First books don't tend to have the biggest audience in the world, but it will mean I can move on to the next thing. So I suppose a little bit of a sanity check there I would recommend. And conducted conversations with colleagues on those lines whenever I've been giving advice. The second point I wanted to pick up on is the peer review process, which I've been very involved with in all ways as somebody who receives reviews on articles and book proposals and book and the whole shebang. So somebody who does them, but also somebody who engages with peer reviewers in my role as editor of German Life and Letters. And it's an imperfect process for all the reasons that my colleagues have hinted at. On the one hand, people are doing this voluntarily, and many people are doing it out of real love of the discipline, and will give great insight in what they write. But it's also a bit potluck who your reviewers are, and you do have to kind of bear that in mind. Particularly, I think, coming from a journal perspective, journals are set up quite differently. There's a whole different array of models for journals. The one that I'm on the editorial board for, I think, is relatively unusual in as much as we've got 7 editors, and between us we actually review everything. So we are very actively involved in reviewing, and we do that because we feel we have sufficient generalist knowledge between us to be able to deal with most things that come our way, and we kind of know what we're looking for. On top of that, we're in the position of wanting to publish the article because we need copy for our journal. And all journals are in this position, by the way, but some of them give out the impression that they're not. But all journals, and this is something I learned somewhere in the middle of my career, all journals actually really need good copy. But they have different ways of indicating to the wider world what their needs are. So the journal editors want to publish the thing. If the peer reviewers who are just kind of an academic who's contacted and asked for an opinion doesn't necessarily want it to be published or not published, so you don't quite know where those people are, and it's a bit more potluck. And that's something to bear in mind, that when you're on the receiving end of a peer review, sometimes what has been written, you just have to push back against it, and editors are well aware of this. So if you've got a bit of a mixed bag of reviews, don't feel that you have to take everything and feel thoroughly depressed. It's quite permissible to push back, and the same applies on book proposals. That I've certainly been on the end of reviews that weren't particularly fair, but having the confidence to say, well, actually that's not right, and show in your own response that can be appropriate. Not always, you can't go arguing with the whole process. But do take some comfort that you can assert some of your own academic judgment, as long as it's reasoned and stands up in the bigger process. The other side of that is, of course, don't dig your heels in and say the whole world doesn't understand me, I've been misunderstood, and only I have the true knowledge here. Even a really rotten review, and I've had a few, even a really rotten one, yeah, you should always look to see, well, what can I take from it? I don't really agree with the overall tenor of this at all, but is there anything in here? Is there anything that's being flagged that if that person was able to read my work and think this, how can I stop other people doing that? So you do always have to have a positive mindset, I think, to what you're reading, but you don't have to let it knock you off course. So So yes, I suppose just again reiterating, it is a bit of a potluck who your reviewers are, and the process as a whole is far from perfect, and it's certainly and slow at the moment, but also in general, and that is a bit where we are, I'm afraid, with the whole thing. I thought I would put in a couple of other points just to broaden the discussion out from the question of publishing a thesis and maybe publishing your first article, because I'm kind of conscious that when you're doing your PhD, there's other ventures that you might be getting involved in. So in particular, you might be starting to edit. We get quite a lot of requests for edited special issues of German Life and Letters, and similarly, I know a lot of edited books, meanwhile, are getting put together by people who are in quite early career stages. It can be a great way to really start to make your name in the field and to get a sense of the different kinds of writing that are out there and how people work. It's also quite a demanding thing to do when you're at an early career stage, because I think to be a good editor, you have to be prepared to be quite interventionist. And in my experience, most editors, a little bit regardless of career stage, a lot of editors hold back a bit too much from really knocking their colleagues' work into shape. And it's difficult when you're just starting out and you're working with people who are significantly more senior. They're not necessarily any better at producing the well-rounded article as somebody who's earlier in their career, and in fact they can have a few bad habits that have become embedded, a bit like driving. So managing editing other people's work can be quite difficult, and I suppose I would say don't underestimate that it's in the UK, where I've come from recently, there's certainly a very strong sense you've got to get as much as possible on your publishing CV as soon as possible. So people they run a conference and then they pull together the papers and they look to publish them with a journal or as a book. It's tricky. It's tricky to do it really well. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but you need to go into it with your eyes open. I guess that's my advice there. Last couple of points, or maybe one point, because I do think we need to have time for questions. Being picky about publishers. I thought it might be worth just saying a couple of things on that. Does it matter who you publish with? I think yes and no is the answer. I will go back to the message I had earlier that, don't let the perfect be the killer of the good, or whatever the saying is, that, don't chase down the top-notch publisher and then end up stuck for years trying to get your work out. And meanwhile, you've not got the CV that you want. You do want to be able to just get your work out there. And there are many, many publishers who will basically help you just get your work out there. And once it's out there and being spoken about, maybe doesn't matter that much who the publisher is. To a degree. At the same time, of course, I sit on appointment panels all the time, and you do look at the CV and you do say, well, who's it being published with? And you do have opinions on which publisher is more prestigious than another, and it is. So yeah, I would be lying to say that it doesn't feed into the wider appointment process. So it's kind of a balancing act. It's better to have things out, probably then with a range of different publishers. If you know that you're maybe going for ones that aren't top-notch, don't go for the same not top-notch publisher the whole time, or it starts to look a little bit like, you really haven't set your sights sufficiently ambitiously for where you want to get to with disseminating your work. So I think that, and some of it is snobbery, because in all honesty, some of those really better known publishers are not necessarily going to give you the best publishing experience. They won't necessarily love your book and push it for you in the way that some other smaller presses might do. But it's a balancing act between getting the work out there and having the kind of recognition you want. And I suppose the point is not to get too hung up on one or the other, just to keep in mind that you've got to be balancing, you've got to be thinking about different things. And I suppose taking a longer term view on where your career is going, and can you afford to make a compromise here in order to get on with a piece of work that will maybe then go in another direction. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca, and that's fantastic, very insightful comment. So I'll invite all of the panelists to turn their cameras back on, and we've got some time to pick up a few questions. So I'll begin. There's a question for Brendan, but I think it's also a question that Sarah might have an opinion on. So is there an issue if the thesis is available open access on an institutional repository prior to being transformed into a book? Can that be a problem for a publisher? Is that something that we need to think through carefully?
Actually, not for us. I mean, again, remember that we are transforming it, so that we would particularly look in a situation like that you actually have really transformed the thesis into a book. But no, not having it available in a repository is fine.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the monograph and the thesis are distinct. And when they're in a repository, the access tends to be staff at the university rather than more widely. So in essence, I'd agree. It's not too much of a problem.
Okay, thank you very much.
Also, it'll probably be the the manuscript rather than the published book, and there are differences. It hasn't been through the copy editing process, etc. So there will be differences.
Yeah. Another question for those of you from presses, perhaps, is the extent to which people might be publishing from the thesis. An individual chapter might be taken as a journal article. Brendan, you mentioned, and I completely understand this, that you're not going to want to publish a monograph which has basically already been published substantially. But is there a kind of tipping point there? Is it possible to be thinking in terms of publishing effectively a version of a chapter in a journal or in an edited collection?
Basically, percentage terms, 25%, above 25%, and we would say no. Okay. But if the whole of the actual book, the proposed book, 75% is new and exclusive to the book, then we would be able to proceed. There are some complexities around that, but now's not the time. But yeah, that's the basic message.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder if I could pick up a question which in a sense began to come out of Rebecca's presentation, and that was around edited volumes. So I suppose we'd all be aware that edited volumes through things like the Research Excellence Framework have tended not to have a particularly good press, if I could coin a phrase, in recent years. And yet, we would also be aware, I'm sure, in our own disciplines that certain edited volumes have been profoundly influential in their own fields. So is there an approach towards edited volumes from publishers? Quite often you see edited volumes which are essentially an assemblage of conference papers, and my guess is often that isn't necessarily the most attractive offering because it may not have coherence. But do you have any views on that? Perhaps Sarah I could go to first.
I think, we publish quite a lot of edited volumes, and some of them do start as conference proceedings. But again, a bit like the thesis transformation to monograph, a collection of papers for conference have to be worked up for an edited collection. So there is, over and under the overarching subject matter, some kind of coherence. And I think this is where the introductory chapter in an edited volume really comes into its own. It needs to do quite a lot of the heavy lifting. So even though some of the chapters might be disparate, there's got to be something that draws them together. And if there are some outliers, they need to be explained why they're in. But as a model to publish in, we quite like them, and it's great for ECRs to get a chapter into an edited collection, whereas with senior established academics as editors. And that's why I say always look out for calls for proposals, always talk to people and network at conferences, and just get involved in the conversation about your field, and you might be able to either submit or be invited to submit a chapter. So we quite like them.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Brendan?
Yeah, we're not so enthusiastic, I don't think. That's not, we do we do them? Again, like Sarah said, if we did and again, we sort of hinted at it in the PhD transformation. To be honest, with the PhD transformation, we would say to people, do not shout about the fact that this is a PhD in the book. Do not say in the acknowledgements, do not say in the introduction, this started out as my PhD. That's not going to help sell the book. It's now just a research book. So we would say that strongly. And I think the same would happen with me if I was offered a volume that came out of a conference. I would immediately start to try to make it not appear like it was, that's where it started from.
Yeah, and I suppose as well, if people are thinking along those lines, it can be that an edited volume might have its genesis in a conference, but in terms of then the range of contributors that you seek to bring together, particularly if there are obvious gaps or there are significant scholars that you think could really make a positive difference, there's nothing to stop you from bringing them in to the team in that way. No, that's great, thank you. I've got a question for Clodagh, I think, which is, how do you select reviewers? Is there a role for early career researchers as peer reviewers?
We will mostly kind of look around to see people whose work will mirror what the particular article that's come in. I mean, there are people who are kind of already experts in that field. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for early career researchers, because sometimes it might be an early career researcher who is that expert in the field and whose work is being cited in the article that we have, and so on. So it can depend, and usually it's that you will be approached, well, from our point of view, it's usually that we kind of brainstorm and find out, try and think of a list of people who would be suitable as peer reviewers for a particular item, and you'll be approached by the editors rather than putting yourself forward as a peer reviewer.
Thank you. Rebecca, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to chuck in the idea of being a book reviewer, because that's something that I did a lot of in the earlier part of my career, and it really helps you it helps you sharpen your own analytical skills on, well, what does make a good book when you're trying to write it out concisely in 500 words. And that's something that journals are always looking for, the journals that still do book reviews, because it's work that's, lots of people don't really have time for, but it is very helpful work, I think, to do just that.
Thank you.
I put Marie Coleman's email for IHS book reviews in the chat there earlier.
Thank you very much. And perhaps a final question, because I'm conscious we're eating into the coffee break now. A final question for Rebecca. And this is a question which I'm kind of asking as somebody who's, mid to late career academic who's had plenty of different experiences along the way. And I suppose any advice you might have, Rebecca, for early career researchers who undoubtedly, won't be able to land every book proposal that they put forward, and every journal article that they submit won't be immediately accepted. So some of it, I think, is about developing a little bit of a thick skin, knowing how to deal with those setbacks without letting it completely throw you off course. I'm not presuming that you've had any of those experiences, given your stellar career, but you might have some insight into that.
Oh, I've had all of those experiences, and that's why it's important to be honest in this forum. And in fact, the very first thing I tried to get published was I did an undergraduate dissertation, and people said, "Oh, there's that you might even consider getting this published." And I had lots more confidence when I was, however old I was, 20. And I was like, oh, great, I'll go and get this published. And I kind of whacked it together and sent it into a journal. And they were like, well, the peer review came back and it was kind of like, well, you might like to consider X, Y, and Z. And I was like, I don't really quite know what to do now, because I hadn't actually consulted any senior colleagues who might have given me some advice. And I was like, maybe I'll just deal with it in the footnotes. And I was really hasty. And I was like, I think I've kind of dealt with that now. And, after not thinking about it too hard, and sent it back in, and, it got rejected. And I felt really embarrassed about that for many years. But the reason I'm sharing this is that don't be hasty. You know, you've got a good long period of time ahead of you probably. Don't rush things, and do take all feedback. You know, really, as I said before, even if it's feedback you really don't agree with, try and see where it came from. And try and do a considered response in what you do. And you know, the piece I did get published, in fact, was in an edited volume, my first piece, and I did do a very considered revising of the initial submission as part of that. And you know, and it remained a piece I was quite happy with for many years. So I think my advice is, you know, yeah, don't be hasty in responding to things that aren't quite going your way. Just be calm and take what you can from the situation.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists for what I think has been an excellent session this morning. We are now officially 3 minutes or so into the coffee break, so I'll have to bring proceedings to a close. But can I also thank Mel Farrell, Director of the IHA, who has put all of this together. And we'll pause now and give people an opportunity to refresh themselves, and then look forward to seeing everybody back for the social media panel at 12:15. Thank you very much.